Step right up to the Death Kiss Traveler podcast, where I take you to the dark side of amusement, and the stories are darker than you think. My name is Marissa, your morbidly curious host, and this is the only podcast that dives into the horror, history, and hauntings in the places meant to bring you joy. From deadly theme park accidents to circus tragedies to the chilling secrets hiding behind county fair rides, I uncover what really happened and the hauntings that may have followed, because sometimes the scariest part of the carnival isn't the ride. Follow Death Kiss Traveler, where fun turns fatal and the past never stays buried. New episodes on Friday. Listen on your favorite podcast platform.
Research and recording of Canadian creepies happens on the shared land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people binds them to share and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with.
Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
Marshall Applewhite and his partner Bonnie Nettles founded the cult Heaven's Gate in the 1970s. It was a UFO-based religion in which they and their followers believed they could transform into immortal extraterrestrial beings. Both Applewhite and Nettles claimed to be the two witnesses from the Book of Revelations in the Bible. The cult ended in 1997 with a mass suicide of the 39 members timed with the comet Hale-Bopp. Charles Manson started the Manson family around the late 1960s. He believed that there was an upcoming apocalyptic race war called Helter Skelter. His following was a mix of the 1960s countercultures, Scientology, occult, and racist ideologies. He exerted control through manipulation, drug use, psychological dominance, and abuse. Jonestown and the People's Temple was founded by leader Jim Jones in the 1950s. It was a group structured around apostolic socialism, mixing Christianity with socialist ideology. It was a highly controlled communal living space with members who were coerced into signing over their property. On November 18, 1979, over 900 Jonestown residents died by drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, and some were forcibly injected. All of these had a singular leader with absolute authority. Those leaders had positioned themselves as being uniquely enlightened or chosen. The groups followed a belief system built around the leader's personal revelations and were isolated from outside influence, with a major shift from spiritual group to a highly controlled environment. The Aquarian Foundation also had a single leader claiming access to higher truths, where there was an escalation of control over time, and the followers were isolated from mainstream society. However, this group believed in communication with the dead and, well, magic. People were lured there under the impression that they could obtain powers and knowledge of the universe. Sort of like a 1920s Canadian Hogwarts. The leader was born as Edward Wilson, but later in life he would start adapting new names, such as Emiliad Valdez, Julian Scazzo, and, most famously, Brother 12. But at the beginning of his life, he was just simply Edward, a kid growing up in England in the late 1800s. When he was 24, he married a woman named Marjorie, and they had 2 children together. For years, they lived a fairly normal life. In 1908, the family moved to Canada and settled along the coast of British Columbia. It was the coast, more than anything else, that appealed to Edward. He loved sailing and spent most of his free time taking small sailboats out onto the Pacific and staying out on the water for as long as he could. At the time, he was working menial jobs for years, delivery runs, basic office work, whatever brought in enough money so he could afford to be on the water whenever he wasn't on the clock. But by his mid-30s, he decided that those low-paying jobs were getting in the way of what he actually wanted to do. So he quit and signed on as a full-time sailor. Now, this wasn't just a career move for him. He actually abandoned Marjorie and the kids. Like, he completely cut off contact with his family and just went out to sea. For him, the sea was worth the trade of his family. Out on the ocean, he spent his days breathing in the salt air and feeling the ship roll under him. And his nights were spent looking up at the stars. He met new people, heard new ideas, and read basically whatever he could find. And this is when he found something that he developed a huge fascination with. By the 1900s, occult ideas were kind of everywhere. And this wasn't fringe ideas, but rather mainstream ideas across the Western world. Secret societies were busy, seances were a business, and mediums were making real money hosting them. New spiritual movements were popping up all across Europe and North America, and one of the biggest ones in that mix was theosophy. The word theosophy comes from Greek, theos meaning God, and sophia meaning wisdom. The movement presented itself as a way to reach divine wisdom. It teaches that there is an internal, universal principle at the source of all life, rather than a single distinct personal God. It also says that its core ethical mission is to form a brotherhood of humanity, regardless of race, creed, sex, or caste. The idea is to pull science, philosophy, and religion into a singular worldview. The modern movement pushed forward by the Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, blends Eastern ideas like karma and reincarnation with Western mysticism. At the very center of this movement was Helena Blavatsky. She was a 19th century occultist who co-founded the Theosophical Society in New York with Henry Steele Olcott. Her books, including The Secret Doctrine, sit at the foundation of the movement. In the late 1800s, she said that she learned secrets about the universe from enlightened beings that she called the Great Masters. She was taught that there were two realities. The first is a physical world that everyone can see and measure, where everything follows the laws of science. The second was the spiritual world, where those masters existed, and where magic and forces outside scientific explanation were real. Now, according to theosophy, you can't just step into that spiritual world outright, but you can get close. You can do so through meditation, study of sacred texts, and ritual works. Through those, the masters can send knowledge directly into a person's mind. They also teach that every single religion holds a piece of truth. So, a serious student is expected to learn from multiple traditions: Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, and others. When Edward encounters theosophy, he goes all in. He spends hours on the ship reading theosophical books and pamphlets. He studies world religions, he studies astrology, he studies magic. He wanted to make sense of both the physical world and the spiritual one, so he performs rituals regularly. He's meditating, he's praying to God and to the great masters, asking for some sort of revelation. By 1924, Edward is 46, and he's still waiting for this breakthrough that he thought all of his studying would lead to. He had spent years digging through theosophical material, and none of it had delivered what he had been hoping for. His personal life wasn't doing so hot at the time either. He hadn't spoken to Marjorie or their two children in more than a decade. He was living in the south of France, unsure of what he was supposed to do next. He was encountering some health problems, and so he couldn't work, and his bank account was virtually empty. He didn't have any plans for how he was going to get through the next stretch of his life. So one cold night, he's laying awake, unable to go to sleep. And at some point, he opens his eyes and notices something above him. A shape was sort of hanging out there, suspended in the dark. It looked like a cross, but the top wasn't a straight line. It was a curved loop. Now, he knows this symbol. It's an ankh, the Egyptian sign for life and rebirth. Given the state he was in, the timing felt pretty important. Then a voice started speaking inside his head. Now, it doesn't give him a name, but he's convinced it belongs to an ancient Egyptian god. The message is very clear. He has a role to play. Something important was coming, and he needed to prepare himself. A strong urge to write hit him out of nowhere. He grabs whatever paper he had and he starts filling it. The words come fast, and he wasn't consciously choosing any of them. It felt like something else was steering the process. After he stops to rest, another vision comes forward, and it's the same thing happening again. The presence takes over, and he writes more. This cycle goes on for about 3 or 4 days. When it finally ended, he sat down and read through everything he put on the pages. As he's reading through all of this material, he decides that he is speaking to one of the great masters of wisdom. He believes that it's the same type of being that the ancient Egyptians once worshipped, the same kind of spiritual teacher that Helena said had guided her when she developed the early ideas of theosophy. According to Edward, the master told him that he had been chosen to teach people who wanted to learn mystical truths. The master said that Edward had a larger purpose. Dark times were coming, end times were coming, and Edward was supposed to help humanity through them. He would face a series of challenges, learn from them, and eventually become a teacher who could help society move towards something better. The master made it clear that he would not be doing any of this alone. In these writings, it said that there would be an apocalypse. No date was given, but it said that a dark spirit would influence world leaders and push them towards greed, cruelty, and corruption. Governments would fall apart. The powerful would take advantage of the vulnerable. Society would collapse, and many people would die. So now Edward is convinced that his role is to help rebuild whatever is left. He was supposed to teach people how to care for the earth and treat others with compassion. And that's how the ruined world would eventually turn into something better. And if he started teaching immediately, he figured he would have a group of followers ready to help him when the time came. So he starts publishing this material that he had written during those visions. Over the next 2 years, he releases 2 books and several articles. They warn about the coming disaster and outline the spiritual ideas he believes he's been given. The writing was dense and symbolic and only made sense to people who already understood theosophy. But the main ideas were there. He wrote that God and magic had existed long before humans. He said that the only way to reach the divine was through years of study. He described the universe as something that was constantly cycling through different destructions and renewal. Forests burns, cities fall, and new life grows afterwards. People, he said, go through the same process. They die and return in new lives, and they're given a chance to improve themselves. So he's essentially speaking about reincarnation. He also said that some of the teachings were too complex to put in a book. Those needed to be taught in person. So he starts to travel through Europe, Canada, and the United States, offering classes on spirituality and magic. And people show up. By 1927, he had more students than he could manage on his own. And with the apocalypse supposedly getting closer, he felt pressure to reach as many people as possible. That's when he decided he needed to do something more structured. He wanted to form a school where he could train people properly. Edward said that the school would allow him to bring in his strongest students as teachers, so he could take on more disciples. He also said that the school would work like an ark. If he and his students made it through the apocalypse, they could go back out afterwards and rebuild what was left. In early 1927, he bought land outside of Nanaimo in British Columbia. It covered 100 acres on Vancouver Island. Now, he said that the great masters had shown him the location in a vision, but this is also close to where he had lived with his wife and children years earlier. So, maybe not so much a vision. Land is expensive. That much land is even more expensive, and the area to live in general is not cheap. But he had money because his students were paying him. This was where he established the Aquarian Foundation. He said the name came from, of course, another vision, and the masters told him the period of enlightenment after the apocalypse would be called the Aquarian Era. Over the next few years, he built the foundation into a functioning school. He hired teachers, he put up classrooms, dining halls, storage buildings, and places for people to live. The school opened in 1928. Within a few months, he had more than 1,200 followers. People traveled to British Columbia from the United States, Canada, and England. Now, his books were not bestsellers, but they were popular in theosophical circles. If someone wanted to learn the teachings, they said Edward was the person to study with, and so they would go out to the Aquarian Foundation and work with him. And by early 1928, problems had already started. Edward had been involved with a woman named Alma Wilson for a while now. When he introduced her to people, he called her his wife, but she was not. He had never actually divorced from his wife Marjorie, and he and Alma had never officially married. While he is out on a trip to Chicago, he meets a woman named Myrtle Baumgartner. She lives in New York City with her husband, who is a very wealthy doctor. She was interested in spiritualism, so Edward invited her to the Aquarian Foundation and told her that he would give her private lessons so that she could develop her abilities faster. Myrtle accepted and left her family to join the school. Her lessons took place in a building that was called the House of Mystery. It was supposed to be a sacred space for meditation and spiritual work, but it was clear to people at the foundation that Edward and Myrtle were not using the building for meditation. Nay, they were having an affair, and they were not subtle about it. Many of Edward's followers thought that this situation was disrespectful. They felt he was mistreating his spouse and Myrtle's husband, and they didn't like seeing the sacred space used for something unrelated to spiritual practice. When they confronted him, he gave them a new explanation. He said he had received another revelation. He now believed that he was the reincarnation of the god Osiris, and he said that Myrtle was the reincarnation of Isis. He also said that he was meant to conceive a child with her, and that child would be the reincarnation of Horus. And he said that Horus would rule during the Aquarian Age. Because of this, some of the followers left the school. Now, some did stay, and after a few months, Myrtle becomes pregnant. She miscarried, and then later she becomes pregnant again, only to miscarry for a second time. Edward takes the loss hard, but in 1929, he found something else to fixate on. He met two students, a 39-year-old woman named Mabel Scotto and her husband. As soon as he saw Mabel, he announced that he had been wrong the years before. Myrtle wasn't his Isis. Mabel was. So he tells Mabel and her husband that he would only teach them theosophy if they agreed to let him sleep with her. They agree. Myrtle was pushed aside and left the community while dealing with her own mental health issues. The child Edward kept talking about never appeared. None of this deters Edward. He keeps going, and he says that he has other predictions, and some of them look convincing to the people around him. In the late 1920s, he's been telling his students that they shouldn't trust the banks. Banks aren't safe, he says, and they don't really know what he means. But then, on October 28, 1929, the stock market collapsed. The crash would set off the Great Depression. For years, bankers and financial experts had insisted that the economy would stay strong, and they had been lending huge amounts of money to stockbrokers, business owners, and investors. So when the crash hit, most of those borrowers couldn't pay anything back. The losses were too large. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all banks in the United States went bankrupt. Anyone who had savings in those banks, they lost everything. But not Edward. He had pulled all of his money out right before the crash, and this was enough to convince many of his followers that he could really see what was coming. He was getting these messages from these higher beings on a different plane. They believed that the rest of his predictions were only delayed and that the end of the world was in fact close. After the crash, he starts to escalate things. He's now making his students learn how to use guns. He sets up new settlements all around his main headquarters. Each one has its own school, its own farm, its own residence. His idea is that if one of the locations is destroyed, the others would still be standing, and so the foundation wouldn't be lost.
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Nikinagana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Nikinagana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led resistance and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit payyourrent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
He's ordering his followers to spend every day farming, preserving food, storing water, basically preparing for some upcoming disaster. He even hires people from the surrounding communities to help with the work. Then he traded most of the cash for gold coins. He said that if the Canadian government were to collapse, paper money would be worthless, but gold, that would still have value. And he had a lot of it. His students had been paying high tuitions for years, and many of them made extra donations. He regularly received checks worth tens of thousands of dollars. By the early 1930s, his personal fortune was estimated at 400,000 Canadian dollars, which would be more than 8 million US dollars today. He kept the gold in a hiding place that only he knew about. At this point, Edward's students are getting tired of this whole situation. Their patience is thin. He's wealthy. He's sleeping with several women, including women who are married to other men. Meanwhile, his followers are doing heavy manual labor every day. And some of the tasks he assigned are harsh for no reason. They're out here stockpiling food, supplies, and guns. That alone put them on the radar of the local police. Throughout the early 1930s, officers kept showing up at the Aquarian Foundation to check on the residents. It felt like the authorities were waiting for some sort of excuse to set the whole place down. Edward gets on edge about this. He tells his students to be ready to shoot police officers if they come too close to the property. And his followers, they want nothing to do with that. Learning how to use guns was one thing. Sure, everybody needs protection. But firing at law enforcement, that's not what they signed up for. That was the point where many of them stopped trusting him and stopped following his orders. Even the people that he had hired from the community are fed up. They're tired of him. He had brought in local labor to help with farming and repairs and prepping, but he had never paid any of them for anything. So, a group of them get together and they sue him for unpaid wages. During the trial, though, something strange happened. In the middle of the hearing, the main witness collapsed in front of everybody. It looked almost like he'd been hit, but nobody had touched him. Then the entire front row of spectators fell over at the exact same time. The judge, he tries to bang his gavel and quiet the room, but he couldn't. Every time he opens up his mouth, just this weird growl comes out. At a later hearing, the plaintiff's attorney was speaking when he suddenly just stops mid-sentence, and he flat out says that his mind has gone completely blank and he can't remember what he'd been arguing. Now, Edward's followers, they said that he did this, that he wiped the lawyer's mind and stopped the judge from speaking. They said that he did it to prove that he has real power. Eventually, the judge dismissed the case and Edward walked out without paying anything, but his legal problems didn't stop there. In 1933, two former students, they file a new lawsuit. They said, Edward, brother 12, he's a fraud. They said that he had taken their tuition money under false pretenses, and they wanted it back. This case goes very differently. There are no incidents in the courtroom. Both sides are able to present their evidence, and the judge rules that Edward is, in fact, a con artist, and he orders him to repay the money. Of course, he doesn't. And when authorities went to the campus to figure out why Edward hadn't paid the court order refund, he was gone. Mabel was gone too. Their house had been torn apart. Several buildings on the property had been ransacked. Someone had actually blown up one of the boats with dynamite. Textbooks, supplies, furniture, all destroyed. A couple of years later, in 1941, there is a piece of paper that turns up under one of the trapdoors in a chicken coop. It mocked Edward's former followers and called them fools and traitors, and a lot of people believed that he left this behind when he fled. Edward and Mabel, they don't surface again until they're spotted in England. After that, they moved to Switzerland in August of 1934. There isn't much anybody back in British Columbia can do about this. And then, 3 months later, news comes out that Edward had died of a heart condition. His death certificate said that he passed on November 7th of 1934 at home. He was 56. But is that really how things ended for Edward? Because 2 years later, a man named Donald Cunliffe, he was in San Francisco near the harbor. And he isn't a former student, but his dad had been, and Donald had met Edward several times. One day, while he's out on the harbor, he saw someone on a ship, and he recognizes him. He says, "This is Edward. Edward is alive." Now, he doesn't get close enough to speak to him, but he is absolutely certain about what he saw. And the sighting sets off rumors that Edward has faked his death. If this is in fact true, there's no way to know how long he lived after 1934. Or, for that matter, where he went. There's also no record of what happened to Mabel either. His gold is also missing. It's never been found. Supposedly, he died without telling anybody where it's hidden, and treasure hunters have searched the old Aquarian Foundation grounds for years, but they haven't found anything. The original Aquarian Foundation was eventually shut down by the British Columbia government. Edward and Mabel had vanished, the money was gone, and the property near Niamo was abandoned. Now, there is a side about Edward that his followers didn't always talk about. For one, he blamed Jewish people for all of the world's problems, and he also hated Catholics. At one point, he had even tried to get in with the Ku Klux Klan, the violent extremist organization responsible for widespread terror, racial violence, and human rights abuse. It was Edward's followers that were keeping the place running. They were the ones doing the heavy labor every single day, and he treated them like they were just there to serve him. He didn't pay them, he didn't take care of them, and he expected them to keep working no matter how rough things got. And he wasn't exactly hiding any of this as well. I mean, he was a real POS. He had money, he had multiple partners. Some of those partners were married to other people. Meanwhile, his followers were exhausted and living under strict rules. Wasn't a good look. There were people who believed his teaching still. They held on to the ideas about how the universe worked. Others had said that he wasn't completely wrong. His group did manage to accomplish some of the things that he talked about. And he had made predictions that did line up with real events, like the bank system collapsing in 1929. That did happen. He also said that dictators would rise and try and take over the world. And then Mussolini took power in Italy in 1925, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Stalin became Premier of the Soviet Union in 1941. And his followers pointed to those events as proof that he had been right in those predictions. He also said that companies would merge and grow until they were powerful enough to rival governments. In the century since he made those predictions, corporations have in fact grown to enormous sizes. Wealth has concentrated at the top. The gap between the rich and the poor widens every day. His supporters also say that that is another prediction of his that he got right. In fact, economists warn that more mergers are coming. At this point right now, the 7 biggest companies in the world hold more money than every country in South America, the Caribbean, and Africa combined. His followers and those who support his teachings today, they also point back to that very first lawsuit. They said that Edward had psychic abilities on top of everything else that he claimed to have. The thing about that is, that was in the 1930s, early 1930s, so there were no cameras in the courtroom and there were no recordings. The only account is of the people who were there. And Edward, he made plenty of predictions as well that didn't happen. I mean, the guy predicted an apocalypse. He said that the Western society would be completely destroyed. He said that his son would lead the world into a new utopia. Now, it's been almost a century since he said that. Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the entire Western world, we're all still here. There was no apocalypse, and there is no utopia, and there's no member of Edward's family ruling anything, let alone a new world utopian society. Now, I'm not going to repeat them here. There's no need. But some of his prophecies were built on hateful stereotypes. They were cruel, and they had no basis in reality. And Edward had some serious character issues. He lied, he cheated on his partners, he abused his followers, he kept wealth for himself. He held very bigoted beliefs. He caused real harm, and none of that really lines up with how you would imagine a spiritual leader to behave. Not to mention Mabel, who he called his partner. She was known as Madame Z, and she was abusive in her own right. She acted as an enforcer at the colony of the DTCP Islands. She pushed people through harsh labor and said it was a spiritual test. She actually carried a horsewhip and used it for intimidation to control the group. She forced people to move between properties whenever she felt like it. Conditions were rough. One man actually tried to escape, and he was locked in a cellar on the Valdez Islands before he managed to row to Nanaimo and report what had happened. But after everything that happened with Edward, Theosophy didn't disappear. Neither did the Aquarian Foundation name. A 19-year-old philosophy student named Kenneth Reinhard was studying at the University of Washington in Seattle. He wasn't just doing coursework, he was reading about Theosophy, and he was interested in world religions, magic, and past lives. One night during the summer, he had a vision himself. The great masters told him that he had a purpose. They told him to start a magical school and help humanity become something better than it was. Sound familiar? In late 1955, Keith opens up his own school in Seattle. He said it would teach people how to perform seances, meditate, recall past lives, and communicate with the great masters, and he called it, you guessed it, the Aquarian Foundation. Now, Keith's abilities, they look a little different from Edward's. Keith was known for seances. He could speak with the dead. There was once a Seattle woman named Hazel Clark who came to him because her mother Phoebe had been missing for several days. The police had searched, volunteers had searched, but nobody found her. So Hazel asked Keith, "Hey, can you help?" Keith agrees to hold a seance, and during the ritual, he makes contact with Phoebe's spirit. He told Hazel that her mother had been walking along the river, tripped, and fell into the water where she died. Hazel takes this information back to the police and asks them to search the river, and sure enough, they found Phoebe's remains exactly where Keith said that they would be. The people said that there was no way he could have guessed something that specific, and word spread pretty quickly. Keith's focus was also very different from Edward's as well. He wasn't focused on an apocalypse and the aftermath of said apocalypse. Instead, he focused on improving people's lives right then, there in the present. At the time, two topics were very controversial around marriage: same-sex and interracial marriage. But Keith, he was very open when he talked about LGBTQIA+2 rights. He supported same-sex marriage. He supported interracial marriage. Those didn't become legal in the United States until 1967 with the Loving decision. And because of that, his teachings, they touched a lot of people. So at the end of the day, the question we really gotta ask is whether Edward's correct predictions made him a legitimate prophet, or whether they were just lucky guesses. Being an evil person doesn't stop someone from having intuition. And even if he did receive some kind of message, he used it for himself, which doesn't line up with any spiritual teaching. And that leaves people deciding how much weight to give a message when the person delivering it is compromised. Edward vanished with his gold and left a whole mess on Vancouver Island for the province to sort out. Keith, though, grabbed the name and ran with it like it was free lumber at Canadian Tire. It turns out the Aquarian Foundation didn't need a prophet. It just needed someone who wasn't busy running from their own fallout. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you love this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And if you're craving even more haunted history and twisted folklore, be sure to check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us keep the weird alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy.